Many of you in the room know Walter, and for you, he needs no introduction. For those of you that don't know Walter, I can tell you a bit about him. Walter is a very distinguished Native American attorney. He spent many years at the Native American Rights Fund. He has authored a very incredible book called In the Light of Justice, The Rise of Human Rights in Native America and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as another very significant book, In the Courts of the Conqueror, the 10 worst Indian law cases ever decided. He is a Pawnee Indian. He is chair of the board of directors for the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums. He served as the staff attorney for the Native American Rights Fund from 1973 to 2009, where he represented Indian tribes, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiians on significant legal issues in the modern era of federal Indian law during the rise of the modern Indian nations and the tribal sovereignty movement. He wanted me to mention that this January he'll be teaching at the Daniel Inouye Center at the University of Hawaii. So if any of you would like to come watch him lecture, get your tickets now. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Walter EchoHawk.
Thank you, Carla, for that very kind and generous introduction. And good afternoon to everyone. I want to thank for my invitation to come to this very distinguished group on this important celebration. I'm indebted to Dean Anaya here at the law school, one of my longtime heroes in my personal life, and also Carla Fredericks, the director of CU American Indian Law Program, as well as the Honorable Chandra Roy Henriksen, the chief of the Secretariat of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Thank you very much for giving me this invitation to speak. And at the outset, I'd like to join the co-sponsors of this conference, including the Native American Rights Fund, in welcoming each and every one of you, especially our visitors from other lands and our UN guests. And I'm truly honored to be here because I stand in awe of the giants who made this landmark declaration that are assembled in this conference, especially the indigenous pioneers who went to the UN, who broke new ground, who worked long and hard, and who never gave up. To me, you are heroes. And also, I am in awe of the United Nations and the officials that are here, both present and past. I laud your work to expand international human rights law and make it accountable to the world's indigenous people. Your efforts in this field are legion. And I bow to each of you, the UN people that are here, as well as our indigenous visitors from other land, and each and every one of you who were involved in the making of this landmark declaration. It's very hard to overstate the enormous importance of the declaration to indigenous peoples all over the world. By setting minimum human rights standards for the dignity, survival, and well-being of the world's indigenous peoples, this declaration holds promise of changing the world. It's a transformative document like the Magna Carta, and on implementation, it'll be very much like Brown v. Board of Education here in the United States, which was probably the most important decision of the 20th century that set our nation on a brand new path. So this declaration is landmark in international law. It's the first time that indigenous peoples were involved in creating a set of standards to meet their own aspirations. And it's the first time that international law is truly accountable to indigenous aspirations. And that represents a fundamental change in international law from oppressing Indian or indigenous peoples during the age of colonialism to, in fact, restoring the human, political, and cultural rights of Native peoples. And if this declaration and its standards are fully implemented, it will fundamentally restructure the rights, relationships, and responsibilities between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples in over 70 nations and improve the lives of some 350 million indigenous peoples. We know that implementation is critical, and that will be the work for this generation. But the potential is great to make the world a better place, and that is why we are here today. And so at this time, I would like to celebrate and commemorate the making of the Declaration by rendering an honor song for the makers of this Declaration. And at this time, I would like to ask the UN officials, both present and past, to rise, if you would, at this time. And also ask all of the indigenous peoples here who were involved in the making of this declaration to rise at this time as well. Please rise and be recognized. I want to render a Pawnee honor song. My tribe comes from the Central Plains of North America here in the heart of the United States. The words of this song, which we use at home sometimes to honor people who have accomplished great deeds, basically says this: the Great Spirit said, "Many prayers have been offered, and now they have been answered." So if you'll rise at this time, I'll try my best to render this song. Hey ya ya, hey ya ya, hey ya oh, hey ya way oh hey, hey ya ya, hey ya oh way oh hey, hey hey ya hey ya hey ya yo, hey ya ya, hey ya oh way oh hey oh hey. Hey, atia say, te waku, hey yo, paku ra chik suki the way, oh hey, hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, oh. Hey yo, hey oh hey, hey ya, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey, 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 oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hi, oh, hey, oh, hey, oh, hey. Hey, tia, say, tiwaku, hey, yo, pakura, chitsu, kitawe, oh, hey. Ah, thank you. Be seated, please. I know you're thinking that I should keep my day job, and you're probably right. I would like to dedicate my remarks to the late law professor G. William Rice of Oklahoma. He was a great teacher of federal Indian law, a mentor to our young generation of Native American attorneys, and an advocate for international human rights. And his wish in his lifetime was that this UN declaration would be implemented in toto. Today, indigenous peoples stand at the confluence of international and domestic law in more than 70 nations around the world. And we can see on the horizon a brand new legal framework for defining indigenous rights, a human rights framework. Thanks to this declaration, we stand at the dawn of the human right era for indigenous peoples worldwide. So this is a historic time. We find ourselves in one of those rare jurisgenerative or lawmaking moments in indigenous history. And the challenge before us in these 70 nations and at the UN is to implement the human rights standards of the Declaration into the domestic law and policy of more than 70 nations around the world. This is a daunting task, seemingly impossible. One of those David and Goliath kinds of struggles. And we stand at the foot of a big mountain. To begin our climb, I think our attention must turn to the domestic arena. Article 38 of the Declaration states that nations must implement these standards into their domestic law and policy in consultation with indigenous peoples. And furthermore, the international law expert, the renowned Professor Siegfried Wiesner, rightly tells us that domestic enforcement of international law is critical. He wrote, and I quote, "Beyond international law's own structures of enforcement, domestic legal systems should be looked upon as the main engines of enforcing international law." So our work now brings us to the domestic arena. A social movement in each of these nations for law reform must be built to create a human rights foundation for defining indigenous rights. And our march to justice must have a strategy, a blueprint for social action and legal reform that will bring us to that promised land. And so the purposes of my talk here at this podium in the time that I have are this. Tomorrow, planning workshops will be held at this conference. Work groups will develop strategies for implementing the Declaration. That strategy-making planning process tomorrow promises to be very illuminating. And I commend the sponsors of this conference for bringing our minds together to plan our march to Indigenous justice. There are some old axioms in war, one being a well-laid plan enables a smaller force to overcome even the strongest foe. So I pray that the Great Spirit will guide us tomorrow in our making of well-laid plans. And as we make our implementation plans to assist tomorrow, I wanted just to add a few of my own thoughts on domestic implementation challenges. As one lawyer that's been engaged in protecting Indigenous rights in the United States since 1973. And I hope, it's my hope that it will be helpful tomorrow to consider the concept of strategic law development. Strategic law development. As seen in legal history, at least in this country, that methodology has helped social reform movements in American history to bring justice to even the most oppressive situation. It works as sure as the rain must fall. So I want to try to define this methodology of strategic law enforcement. There's many lawyers and law students in this room. We sit in the famous Wolf Law Building on CU campus at the very font of knowledge, or at least near to it. So I want to try to define this, this social law reform methodology, and then look at a couple case studies to illustrate how this has been employed and how it has brought success to other oppressed groups in decades past. So let me turn to that task now. And first, I want to identify the advocacy problem that sits before us, and then define the term strategic law development, and finally talk about some case studies that illustrate strategic law development in action. So first, to identify what is the advocacy problem as an Indigenous advocate that now sits before us. And we know that many Indigenous peoples around the world live under existing legal systems derived from the early law of colonialism. Those legal frameworks are often bereft of the human rights principles. So advocates today must find ways to reform and strengthen those frameworks in these more than 70 countries around the world. More specifically, the challenge at hand is to implement the human rights standards of the Declaration into the domestic law and policy of more than 70 nations around the world. As mentioned earlier, this is a daunting task. It calls for rising above our day-to-day work as attorneys and Indigenous advocates. We won't get to the promised land by a business-as-usual approach. And I also think we have to turn our primary attention from the international arena at this point and begin focusing on work at home in the domestic sphere. I'm not saying that the international realm is irrelevant, but we already have our foundational document in place now with this declaration. And as Siegfried Wiesner said, it's the domestic legal systems that are the primary engines of enforcing international law. So what is strategic law development, and how can that be employed in our domestic legal systems to embed the human rights principle for Indigenous peoples? I would say at the outset that lawyers are trained to be problem solvers. Clients come in the door, they have a problem, they look to attorneys to solve their problem. And so legal advocates are continually searching our legal system for the best forums to present our claims, the best legal theory for presenting our claims, and the best strategy for meeting our clients' needs and solving their problems. Sometimes this search entails changing the law. When we search the system from head to toe and we see the law is inadequate, the law may even be bad, there may not be an adequate forum out there, then our task as a problem solver, we have to change the law. We have to find or create better forums. And that is a proactive process called strategic law development. It can be done on a very discrete, small, issue-by-issue basis that comes across our desk. It can be done on a small-scale, client-by-client basis as well. Or it can be done on a larger, grander scale by advocates when we're faced by systematic legal problems that are at stake. And I want to focus up here on large-scale strategic law development done by attorneys acting as social engineers. So my definition of strategic law development basically refers to the problem-solving function of attorneys, and on a large-scale strategic law development effort, I define it simply as the tactics and strategies used by attorneys as social engineers to reform the law for the better, to provide effective remedies for clients, and to solve a problem. And the premise of large-scale strategic law development is basically that the law is imperfect. It's merely a man-made institution, and it needs a continual, well-directed study of its defects and how to cure them. This idea is not new. It's been around a long time. It's seen in the writings of Roscoe Pound, and I would refer you to his article, The Lawyer as Social Engineer, 1954. Roscoe Pound saw the law as a mechanism for social change. He looked at what is termed sociological jurisprudence, in which the law is a means for reform and an agent for social change. And in this process, the lawyer is a social engineer who assists in the administration of justice. In that role, attorneys must be highly skilled practitioners who are perceptive problem solvers. In that capacity, the administration of justice, a goal is to help the courts and to help our lawmakers achieve needed reforms so that those institutions can bring the law to its highest and finest hour. And history has shown in our country that in social justice movements, strategic law development has been a critical methodology for success. And I want to just draw your attention briefly to two case studies that illustrate this point, that might give us lessons learned and some food for thought in developing our well-laid plans tomorrow. The first case study is the Black American experience or social justice movement from Plessy v. Ferguson, which was handed down in 1896, all the way to Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. A 58-year struggle that is really well told by Richard Kluger in his big book entitled Simple Justice. This is a very riveting tale, very familiar to Americans. But he points out that American slavery, which was legalized by the Marshall Court, was an institution that was as fully severe and demeaning as any recorded in history. There were no legal rights accorded to slaves, no access to the courts, thanks to the Dred Scott decision. No, they could own no property. They had no freedom. They were simply living life in human bondage. It was even illegal to teach Black Americans. Their minds were in slavery, were left to a trophy. And nothing, according to Richard Kluger, departed so dramatically from our core values than the institution of human slavery. There were efforts in the 19th century, by way of background, to ending slavery, the Civil War, the enactment of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the civil rights laws that were passed in the 19th century. And yet, by the end of that century, this entrenched racism prevailed. The Supreme Court essentially wilted and then handed down this infamous Plessy v. Ferguson that established the American law of racial discrimination under the separate but equal doctrine. That is, racially segregated schools can pass constitutional muster so long as they're equal to the white schools. The impact of that doctrine, of course, on Black America was to free American racism from any bounds placed upon it by the law, to release any inhibitions, and it did unleash a torrent of racial hatred, Jim Crow laws in every sector of our country. And so that by the early 20th century, whites despised and ridiculed and tormented the black race in this nation as never before, even during the slavery era. So the NAACP began a social movement to move from that legal framework of racial discrimination to equality under the law. It was founded in the year 1910 with the goal of stemming the tide of prejudice that was engulfing Black America. It sought to provide legal relief for the Black race, and it picked the courts as the battleground, as the great equalizers, the court systems. But the hurdles that NAACP faced in 1910 were immense. There was a great need for remedial relief. 10 million Black Americans were facing systematic discrimination. It was a severe problem, lynchings, Jim Crow laws. So there was an urgent need to bend the law and make it more just. But unfortunately, there was no such thing as civil rights law in 1910. There were no Black attorneys in 1910. There were no law schools that would let Blacks learn the law, except for Howard University, which was a tumbled-down brick building that was unaccredited. There was no battle plan that NAACP had in 1910. It had no money. So one by one, these hurdles were overcome by the NAACP, even though it stood at the foot of a big mountain at that time. Among the earlier ingredients for its march to justice was strategic law development, to put together a strategy, a litigation plan. And that was done in 1934 by the Margold Plan. And the essence of that plan was to use existing law to litigate under the existing legal framework established by Plessy v. Ferguson, the separate but equal doctrine, but to find the most protective features within that existing framework that could advance Black American aspirations. Why did they pick the existing legal framework to accomplish their goals? They didn't want to antagonize a hostile Supreme Court. So they said, we'll just go with the existing legal framework as we find it. We'll try to use the best features that we can find within it, and we'll take it as far as we can go. And with that strategy, under the theory that to be equal, the schools have to be, the schools must be truly equal to pass constitutional muster. NAACP targeted the worst schools in the country, the most unequal schools, and litigated to enforce the most protective features that could be found within that framework. And one by one, these unequal schools begin to fall. Then, several years later, NAACP found its champion. It found its hero in the ranks of Black attorneys, Thurgood Marshall. the Thurgood Marshall era from 1934 to 1954. He led the NAACP Defense Fund. It only had 5 staff attorneys in 1950. He argued and won 29 of 32 Supreme Court cases. But by 1950, this legal strategy of NAACP came to a crossroads. It had brought Black aspirations as far as it could go. The Supreme Court, in a trilogy of cases in that year, agreed with their legal theory. Schools got to be separate but equal. So to go any further, NAACP had a choice. It could either sue each and every single solitary segregated school in the nation from now to kingdom come, which would have been like emptying the ocean 1 cup at a time, or it could change its strategy and mount a frontal assault on the separate but equal doctrine itself, and argue that racial segregation is inherently discriminatory in violation of the Equal Protection Clause. They chose the latter, using another old-time axiom from the law of war. When that door opens, you must rush through it and seize your prize. And they had the momentum at their back with this trilogy of Supreme Court cases. They had the U.S. Justice Department lined up. They had a large army of law professors, scholars that were providing assistance. They had a huge network of local co-counsel for their nationwide cases of these 5 staff attorneys. And they began in 1950 the final march to justice by an all-out frontal assault on the Plessy Doctrine. And that came to pass in the victory in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. When Thurgood Marshall walked into that courtroom, he would not be denied. And he overcame the attorneys that were arrayed against him. And he made a place in heaven for our civil rights attorneys and our public interest attorneys. You can't find many lawyers in heaven, but we got a little place there. But that legal campaign has a lot that can teach us, and I commend that book to us, our reformers in this room here. It placed America on a brand new path that 2 generations later allowed us to elect the first Black American president of the United States. And it was the most important decision that changed the complexion of America that was handed down in the 20th century. My second case study is the American Indian tribal sovereignty movement from about 1960 to the present day, which was a march in the United States from federal policies of termination to those of self-determination. A 57-year struggle. Native America didn't face slavery and its troubling aftermath. Rather, we faced an equally egregious human rights situation in this nation, the legacy of conquest and the legacy of colonialism, with the harsh ill effects that are very well known in our history. Invasion, more than 40 Indian wars, the appropriation of Indian lands, which by 1950 we only had less than 2% of our land base, disease, destruction of our cultures, our indigenous habitats, the loss of our sovereignty and subjugation. Many of those lingering effects were still seen in 1960. We had just come through the nadir of Indian country in the early 50s through this termination policy, which I think is one of the end products of the law of colonialism. We were living with the dark side of federal Indian law, pursuant to the Tehatun case that was handed down in 1954 or 55 by the same court that decided Brown v. Board of Education. We had communities engulfed by historical trauma. And so the goals of that generation in the 1950s and 60s and on down to the present day was to coax the government from its destructive policies here in the United States and to a more enlightened policy of Indian self-determination. In 1970, President Nixon handed down this Indian self-determination policy. That was the crowning success of 20 years of indigenous advocacy in the United States. But in 1970, it was only a policy. It remained to be implemented across the country, and that became the work of two generations from 1970 to the present date to implement self-determination across our country. And we used a strategy fairly similar to that of NAACP. We simply took the existing legal framework as we found it, which had some protective features, but also had a dark side to it. And we tried to coax the courts. And Bruce Green, I see you here as one of the early litigators there, to coax the courts into applying the protective features of federal Indian law and the government as well. That is the doctrine of inherent tribal sovereignty from the Worcester decision, together with its protectorate principles. And then we simply lived with the dark side of the law. We made no effort to overturn the 10 worst cases of federal Indian law ever decided. We didn't mount any frontal attacks on Johnson v. McIntosh, Lone Wolf, Tehatun, and the others that make us poor, that hold us back, that render our victories vulnerable. We simply lived with that dark side, but we came a long way. And we witnessed the rise of our modern Indian nations in this country under that strategy. But I submit to you today, we can go no further in our aspirations. We've ridden that pony as far as it can take us. And to go any further in our aspirations, we have to turn and mount a frontal assault on the dark side of federal Indian law. We stand today here at the same crossroads that NAACP stood in 1950. So today our task is to reform the dark side of federal Indian law, I think, and reform the dark side of the law, indigenous law in other countries. The question has always been, well, what do we replace it with? The answer is seen in this declaration. Let's replace it with human rights. These are the strongest principles known to man. They were the principles that were referred to in the American Revolution. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that people possess higher powers that come to us from higher rights, from higher authorities. including the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These human rights precepts were on our lips at every juncture during the rise of this democracy, the growth and expansion of this democracy. And I think we need to go back to the basics and bring the native peoples within the ambit of that. And we use strategic law development along the way in this tribal sovereignty movement, but only on an issue-by-issue basis. We used it to get the Indian Child Welfare Act passed, as Jack Trope is familiar with. We used it to get the NAGPRA legislation enacted. We used it in the American Indian Religious Freedom Act amendments to overturn the infamous Smith decision. But we've never brought a frontal assault on these Supreme Court cases that comprise the dark side of federal Indian law. So these are some case studies. I think that some lessons learned is, I think one of them is that we can kind of look and see around today that indigenous peoples, I think, are better positioned now to begin their march to justice in the year 2017 than NAACP was in 1910. We have our international human rights instrument in place in this declaration. In many countries, native peoples, including here in the United States, have amassed skill, bravery, and experience from the last two generations of indigenous rights, legal and social justice work. We have, I think, the wind at our back with the passage of this UN declaration after 20 years hard work in the UN Human Rights Framework. 150 nations have endorsed it, making it the new order of the day. So I think now we're poised for the final push in these 70 countries, in these domestic legal systems. We have here in our own land more than 2,000 Native American attorneys. When John EchoHawk and I went to law school, there was less than a dozen. You could count us on fingers and toes. I think the second lesson we have here is that law reform is the key, folks, in our march to indigenous justice. Our domestic legal systems are the main engines for enforcing international law, and that includes these standards in the Declaration. We need lawyers of a certain kind. It's another lesson, I think, learned in both of the Black America movement and the American Indian tribal sovereignty movement. You need lawyers of a certain kind. Public interest lawyers that are visionaries, that can act as social engineers. Not just lawyers who are content to stand pat on the shoulders of their forebears, but lawyers who are social engineers versed in strategic law development methodologies and conversant in the language of human rights. Further, I think as we lay our well-laid plans tomorrow, we should also think about the role of legal scholars and legal theorists in our march to justice. In these other case studies, they wore many hats in those campaigns. They performed the brain power. They helped develop strategies. They provided amicus brief support in the cases. they trained a new generation of legal advocates. And to the law professors, I would say it's not enough simply to teach federal Indian law and the holdings of individual cases without teaching students to look beyond our legal framework to the larger picture. Finally, other lessons learned just quickly, and I'll wrap up here. We need a command center in each of these domestic legal systems in these more than 70 countries. Infrastructure. We need seed money. We need a strategy to be put in place as our foundation, our compass as we navigate new waters here. And the axiom there is that the general, this is another war axiom for you veterans here, the general makes many calculations in his temple before the battle begins. And then, of course, we need to mobilize the larger sectors in each of these countries to assist indigenous peoples. Black America could not have overturned Plessy v. Ferguson all by itself. It needed help from other Americans of goodwill. The tribal sovereignty movement could not have accomplished its work either without coalition building in these issues that I mentioned earlier as well. So there are lessons out there that can be learned, that can be put to use, and they work as sure as the rain must fall, as sure as the rain must fall. So with that, we can look around. The world is now embarking on implementing this UN declaration worldwide. Countries are in a different stages of implementation. It's easy to pass a law, but hard to enforce it. And that, I think, is the task at hand. In Canada, we can look to the north in Canada and see there's nearly 20 or probably about more than 20 cases that discuss this UN declaration brought by First Nations in Canada, beginning a judicial discourse into the nature of human rights for the First Nations. In Canada, advocates have got a bill introduced in their parliament to incorporate the declaration into Canadian policy. In Canada, human rights are on the lips of the First Nations peoples up there. They're very conversant with human rights in that nation. In the United States here, our country endorsed this declaration in 2010. But I think Indian country was unfamiliar with it, slow to grasp that opportunities that were presented. You might say we failed to act during the Obama administration when that window of opportunity was open. But we've been involved in a self-education process in Indian country here in the United States. We've had conferences on the subject, National Congress of American Indians, tribal leader forums, grassroots organization conferences such as the Seventh Generation Fund. We have the groundbreaking report done by UN Special Rapporteur James Anaya in the year 2012 that shows, it's entitled The Situation of Indigenous Peoples in the United States of America. It shows us the starting where we begin our march to justice. It makes recommendations for change. It's one of those rare transformative documents that comes across the once in a great while as a harbinger and catalyst for change. We have Greg Bigler, Judge Bigler's group in Oklahoma now, composed of traditional people in Oklahoma, tribal leaders, some tribal attorneys that are translating the UN Declaration into the Muskogee Creek language and beginning talks about how we can go about implementing those standards. And also now we have the Native American Rights Fund as our premier public interest law firm for Native America, teaming up with the Colorado University School of Law to form a joint project for implementing this UN declaration in our nation here, which I hold to be a very, very significant step in our nation. So I think we're poised here in our nation to begin a march towards justice. Even though right now we have no case law, we have no bills being presented in any lawmaking body in Congress, we're at a very nascent stage, but we're poised. So in conclusion, folks, I commend these thoughts to you as we make our plans tomorrow. The ball is in our court, and tomorrow we begin making implementation plans. From where the sun now stands, let us work for the full implementation of human rights for Indigenous peoples worldwide. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you, Walter, for that amazing talk. We will reconvene in 10 minutes in the courtroom. 10 minutes in the courtroom.